Thank you for this very kind introduction. I'm so happy to finally meet you. I just said this in the break, and happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. The aim of this panel is, as Anna Cavalco wrote to me in her invitation, to discuss the potential relevance of Jewish cultural artifacts for the study of Jewish history, Wissen, schaft des Judentums in particular. In my presentation, I will focus on the relevance of dispersed objects, books, for research into the history of an institution, the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. Thus, I'll explore how provenance research, or rather collection research, can contribute to the history of science, Wissenschaftsgeschichte. Having said this, I'm no expert for the history of Wissenschaft des Judentums, and I've not been reconstructing the Hochschule library for the last months like Bettina and Anna did. Thus, to them, many of the things I'm going to say will be utterly boring, I'm afraid, as they will have come across these things already. But this is not the point. I'm not trying to display new research on the Hochschule. I would simply like to show how provenance or collection research can help to understand an institution, its functions, and its research practices. And I would go so far as to say that the history of the library of the Hochschule might even be essential to understand the Hochschule as an institution. Years ago, I stumbled about an article by Moritz Steinschneider on jüdische Literatur from 1850 for the Enzyklopädie der allgemeinen Wissenschaften und der Künste, in which he devoted an entire paragraph to Quellen, sources, and summarized: Der jüdischen Literatur fehlt jede Anerkennung, jedes Institut nach allen Seiten hin, und doch verlangt man von vielen Seiten her reife Früchte, von deren Saat man nichts wissen will. Na? Can you switch for me? To his scholarly account of the development of a multilingual Jewish literature dispersed around the globe, he thus added a critique of the devastating effects that a lack of special collections and autonomous collection-based research had on the status of Jewish literature. There were hardly any special libraries devoted to Hebrew books and manuscripts in Germany, and only a few scholars studying Hebrew books as texts and artifacts in their own right, as you know. It was utterly difficult to see Hebrew books in their historical contexts and settings, as books were dispersed. When Steinschneider wrote his article, two important collections, the extraordinary library of David Oppenheimer from Prague and Hermann Michael from Hamburg, had just been purchased by British research libraries, Bodleian Library and British Library. And these two events seem to have upset many Jewish scholars. In a way, these sales were, I think, traumatic, as they reappear again and again in articles. And they demonstrated, I think, the sheer lack of institutional backing and research infrastructure in Germany. In Steinschneider's opinion, the lack of a panoramic view, which only closed collections of Jewish literature enabled, impeded all scholarly work. Ursache und Wirkung ist gegenwärtig kaum mehr zu unterscheiden, aber unleugbar ist die erwähnte Tatsache. Steinschneider here alludes to the fact that libraries are a prerequisite for research, and yet libraries can only be turned into useful research tools if they are arranged and described by someone who understands these books in their historical and contemporary context. For me, it was interesting to look at the Hochschule against this background, as its history, like to look into the motivation to establish a library, aside from like the obvious necessity to have books around you when you do studies. At this conference, we look at the library of the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums almost as it was an archive, even if the dispersed constituents of this body of writings are to be found on library shelves. A more appropriate term would be collection. No matter which term is used, this is a rather specific way to look at these books. They are treated as a unified, closed entity, in this case as the product and legacy of an institution. The institutional provenance, Hochschule, is the one governing principle linking books on diverse topics together. Next, please. So the stamps mark this link in a way, but you also see that there were several stamps and that might have also affected the library, its setup. I don't know, but it's something to look into, I think. Single books thus become traces of a once dynamic context, specific practices, forms of knowledge. In such cases, it is a task of historical research to try to find out more about the specific practices that constituted this entity in the first place. Adopting an archival perspective, like looking into original order or provenance, it then becomes important to preserve, to document, and research transmission history, original order, and historical systems of arrangement, as they might tell us something about past value, judgment, categories of knowledge, historical context as traces of work practices. All of these can be decisive for the understanding of individual materials within these larger contexts. If such historical contexts are destroyed, it can become an epistemic task beyond legal and commemorative aspects to reconstruct them. But the characteristics of books can produce some conflicts here. In many cases, the biographies of books lead to other collections and previous or later contexts of knowledge. Books may have gone through several changes of ownership before they were integrated into the Hochschule library. Due to the destruction of Jewish cultural institutions after 1933, the shelves of the Hochschule library were only a transit station for the books the institution had gathered and strived to preserve. During its 70 years of existence, the library changed, developed, and relocated several times. Libraries, like almost all collections, are not static entities. Collections are formed and collections are dispersed, and its parts may become the core for new collections which exist for some time, and so on and so on. In a way, these dynamics are a prerequisite for the emergence of new knowledge. Provenance, Herkunft, as a term, reflects these modes of circulation in contrast to ideas of origin, Ursprung. In many cases, books direct us to more than one collection they once formed part of. And especially in a digital environment like today, it is easily possible to depict a certain state of historical order without having to do so at the expense of another order. So, but of course, it's legitimate or even necessary to privilege a context that had decisive impact on the history and practice of Wissen, schaft des Judentums between 1872 and 1942. And it's necessary to research and reconstruct a collection which was destroyed because it was a Jewish collection, thus looted, forced into hostile collection contexts, rearranged, finally destroyed. In the following paragraphs, I'll speak of contexts, as mentioned in the title, in a very wide sense. In a strict sense, context means collection context. One could think, to use an image from Michael Polanyi's implicit knowledge or tacit knowledge, of a landscape or other complex entities in which each individual form has meaning. While the shape of the landscape cannot come into view in the isolating, exclusive focus on individual trees or flowers or books, the thorough analysis of these details contribute to a deeper understanding of the landscape as soon as the view is directed again to this context as a phenomenon in its own right. But to this collection context, I will only attend to at the end of my presentation. Before this, I would like to explore how traces of the Hochschule library can tell us something about processes of institutionalization, collection development, functions of the library's scholarly networks. Context here also alludes to the fact that the books once owned by the Hochschule are not the only sources to get to for answers to these questions. There's a lot of contextual information that can be important, as Bettina and Anna know. So next slide, please. Several sources can help to reconstruct a collection and its history. This is different from straightforward provenance research, although there are apparent overlaps. With regard to the Hochschule, the following potential sources came to my mind. In my talk, is only based on very few sources. I try to mark them. and there is a rich variety one may look at. In the case of the Hochschule, important sources might have been lost and destroyed, such as, for example, at least I do not know of a library catalog or accession books, things like this, which are usually like a prime source to find out more about an institution's history. But nevertheless, it's important kind of to keep these potential sources in mind and look for them. Maybe they are still somewhere. So I will only focus on ownership marks, call numbers, and some printed sources for my very limited talk. Many of the books that once belonged to the library bear the names of previous owners, stems of other institutions aside from the Hochschule stems. They can be traced in the looted cultural assets database. It's an amazing database. The Hochschule library depended to a large extent on book donations. In their first report of activities for the years 1872 to 1873, the founders, the board of the Hochschule, stressed this fact. This report and the following annual reports list book donations and thus pay tribute to those benefactors who enabled collection development. The first report emphasizes, den eigentlichen Stamm unserer Bibliothek bildet die Schenkung der Frau Professor Sarah Lazarus, welche in hochherziger Betätigung ihres wohlwollenden Interesses für unsere Hochschule die von dem verstorbenen Professor Dr. M.A. Levy in Breslau nachgelassene Bibliothek im Ganzen erworben und mit selbiger der Bibliothek unserer Hochschule eine breite und solide Grundlage gegeben hat. Next picture, please. The bookplate commemorating this important donation lists two names, Sarah Lazarus, the donor, and Abraham Moritz Levy, the previous owner of these books. Miss Lazarus had given to the library. Sarah Lazarus was the wife of Moritz Lazarus, I think, one of the founding members and members of the Kuratorium of the Hochschule until his death in 1903. And it's interesting that the bookplate only mentions her name, while I was unable to find any picture of her. So I think that's kind of a question to ask. Why is his name not on this plate? And was he involved in this acquisition, which was foundational? The Hamburg-born Abraham Moritz Levy, trained as a rabbi, was a teacher of religion of the Jewish community in Breslau. He gained some temporary scholarly reputation with studies in the fields of Semitic paleography and epigraphy. He was even rewarded with the title of a royal professor for these works. The donation thus marks some links between Berlin and Breslau. And there were many other donors at this list shows. And as you see on this page, some only gave a few select books to the Hochschule, some donated money and enabled the library to acquire books on a focused way, systematically, independent from contingencies of gifts, which sometimes can be nice additions, and sometimes such gifts can be a burden to a collection scheme. As is the case with many public research libraries until today, the acquisition and integration of private collections was a quick and sometimes the only way to develop a collection in certain fields. As Moritz Lazarus emphasized, it was one of the advantages of the Hochschule library that the core was, quote, von gelehrter Hand gesammelt, collected with scholarly expertise. Even before these books entered the library, they had formed part of a private scholarly collection and perhaps even embodied an individual system of knowledge. How did the Hochschule treat these books? Did the librarian preserve their previous order? Or were books rearranged to fit into categories that would reflect priorities of the Hochschule? This question must remain open here, but I will return to this larger topic of arrangement and classification later on. The report at the bottom, no, please, the last picture. Yeah. The report emphasizes the fact that for scholarly Jewish collections in Germany, a preservation was by no means common. In weiteren Kreisen wird es mit dankbarer und freudiger Genugtuung anerkannt werden, dass durch diese der Hochschule gewidmete Schenkung der Levischen Bibliothek das gewöhnliche Schicksal jüdischer Bibliotheken in Deutschland erspart worden ist. Sie hat nicht ins Exil wandern brauchen und wird, selbst ein Produkt mühseliger und ausdauernder Arbeit, auch an ihrer neuen Stelle für wissenschaftliche Forschung eine fruchtreiche Quelle bilden. Sämtliche der Bibliothek der Hochschule geschenkten Bücher werden mit dem Namen der Geschenkgeber bezeichnet. Außerdem bewahrt das Buch der Bibliotheksfundatoren das Andenken derjenigen, welche durch Geschenke von Büchern oder durch Geldspenden uns ihren Beistand gewähren. Retrospectively, the certainty that Levi's books would not be exiled is tragic, especially since exile already at that time seemed to have been a common fate for Jewish libraries. Aside from the few books traced by provenance researchers so far, lists of donors provide additional information for further straightforward provenance research. And it's a pity that this book, der Bibliotheksfundatoren, the book of library founders, has not yet been located, I think. The names of these donors are important sources in many other ways, though. First and foremost, they reveal the social network of the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. Who were these people that donated books? What is their cultural, religious, national, political, economic background? Why did they support the Hochschule and did they also teach or study there? Next picture, please. Bertha Oppenheimer, the wife of John. Sorry, is this the right pictures? Can you switch to the next one? I can. Yeah. Bertha Oppenheimer, the wife of John Bernd Oppenheimer and Fanny Oppenheimer, wife of Bertha's son Hermann Oppenheimer in Leipzig, were, for example, members of the wealthy Oppenheimer family whose fortune was based on banking and wholesale trade. Both women donated funds to purchase books from the library of Joseph Zedner, London, a learned bookseller, bibliographer, and historian of the book. In 1845, Zedner had moved from Berlin to London to take on a position as librarian of the Hebrew department of the British Library. There he catalogued the valuable library of Hermann Joseph Michael, which I have mentioned already. It was one of those two important Hebrew collections that had been sold to British institutions before the establishment of the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. And I think it's interesting that like this way, Zedner's library was kind of getting back from London. 2 years later, Bertha and Fanny Oppenheimer also acquired the library of Dr. Julius Fürst, an Orientalist scholar and expert for Semitic languages and literature in their hometown, Leipzig. But were these ladies approached by scholars, or did they take the initiative to secure this important collection? Was their donation part of a larger scheme of widely scattered cultural sponsorship, something for everyone, or did they want to support the Hochschule specifically? And if so, why? And here, letters might kind of provide more information. In some cases, the curatorium of the Hochschule provided explanations. Thus, in February 1875, the board of the Jewish community had apparently sponsored the acquisition of the library of Abraham Geiger, dem Heimgegangenen hier mit der Werkstätte, in und aus welcher er geistig geschaffen, ein lebendiges, fortwirkendes Denkmal zu errichten. This sentence, by the way, suggests that this collection was preserved as a complete body and not integrated into the general collection. Geiger's library was treated as sort of a monument. Other scholars donated recently published literature, such as Gustav Karpeles. This listing of names of donors and previous owners of books could go on and on. Private collections provided the basic foundation for the library of the Hochschule, which in 1875 consisted only of about 2,000 books and expanded considerably over the years. And some books seem to bear accession numbers, so there might even be a chance kind of to follow up on how the library kind of developed. But I only had access to kind of those books that were listed in the Cultural Looted Assets database, so maybe Bettina can has more information. Only in 1892, the library got its own annual budget to acquire books independently. before they had to ask for permission of the board for each acquisition. As Ismar Elbogen emphasized in a Festschrift published on the occasion of the Hochschule's relocation to its first own building, the budget finally allowed for some Übersicht und größere Planmäßigkeit in den Anschaffungen. Indirectly, this phrase indicates the lack of orderly and focused collection development in the founding years of the Hochschule. Thus, this would explain some oddities. Beside donations, direct purchases, there seems to have been another path for books to come into the library. Various institutions sent their annual reports. The Hochschule reports lists those pamphlets, occasional writings, brochures, reports, yearbooks, and as donations. And yet they might have formed of something like a Schriftentausch, like an informal or formal exchange of publications between institutions as kind of like proud products of their work. While these contemporary publications might seem to be of minor relevance and value with regard to the establishment of a research infrastructure for Wissenschaft des Judentums, they might have been of utmost importance with regard to the institutional ties that guarantee an institution's standing, its being part of a conversation, as well as its knowledge of ongoing research in other places. Carlos Spurhase and Steffen Martus have recently published a book, Geistesarbeit, eine Praxeologie der Geisteswissenschaften, on all these inconspicuous practices that we should take into account if we are interested in the history of knowledge and the history of ideas. Next. Yeah. And here I just show such an occasional writing to which even one of the first library curators of the Hochschule contributed. So you see all these kind of, like all these little pamphlets contribute to this networking. I looked for reports and brochures in the looted cultural assets database, but I only found a few examples. In the 1980s, Arnold Esch published a fundamental essay on Überlieferungschance und Überlieferungszufall. Überlieferung, I translate as historical sources, is what the historian holds in his hands, what has been handed down to him about earlier times, what has been handed down to him from earlier times. The historian knows that this knowledge is fragmentary, but what he holds in his hands is not so clear to him. Thus, he often succumbs to the natural feeling to regard the pieces that he holds in his hands as heavier, more important than those he does not have. Against this background, collection research requires contextual information, such as these annual reports of the Hochschule, since they might help to put the objects themselves, the objects listed in the looted cultural assets database, into perspective. These reports provide a framework to understand the books we hold in our hands in their historical lost context. It seems that unequal chances of preservation often favor the unusual, extraordinary, striking sources at the expense of everyday life, the usual, normal, ephemera. Perhaps rare books were taken more seriously than the pamphlets, auction catalogs of prints. With their dedications. Some distortions are obvious, others are less noticeable and therefore much more delicate, maybe. In the end, provenance research engenders collection research to understand these processes. At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned it might be interesting to know whether the arrangement of Abraham Levy's scholarly private library was kept by the library of the Hochschule, or if it was rearranged and to meet a more standardized knowledge regime. This leads to more general questions regarding the library's arrangement, I think. A library classification cannot be neutral and objective. It reflects the approach of its creator and the organizational context in which it was created. Thus, the arrangement, classification, and description of the books of the Hochschule library are important for at least two reasons. Organizational context. And please, the next, yeah. The classification might reflect the institution's affiliations with other institutions. Did they follow a certain model? Maybe the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau, or rather the classification introduced at the Staatsbibliothek Berlin, or maybe it's a variation of this Qatar classification system the Library of Congress instituted. Or maybe the library developed its own classification. Maybe classification was only introduced as the library developed and was not there in the beginning. Basically, libraries either follow a subject classification tailored to the special needs of a discipline, or they adopt a universal classification system. Both choices are telling. The latter aims at covering all fields of knowledge in a system equally. During the 19th century, libraries started to develop such standards for classifications as they acted more and more in networks. How did the Hochschule situate the knowledge kept on the shelves of its libraries, given the fact that Ismar Elbogen and many others stressed the fact that Jewish studies form part of the general field of academic studies and scholarship? Jede Wissenschaft kann daher nur im Zusammenhang mit der gesamten Wissenschaft als Teil der allgemeinen Wissenschaft gedeihen. Wer Vernunft und Wissenschaft verachtet, dem wird auch seine bestimmte Wissenschaft sich nicht erschließen. Did the practice of research and teaching reflect this line of thought? And I think there things like classifications, etc., can show like these spaces of negotiating, Aushandlungszonen. The traces of the Hochschule library and the classification numbers in books provide concrete materials to engage with these questions. Approach of the institution. Wissenschaft des Judentums was, I think, a relatively young discipline. In the beginning, scholars in the field had to rely on sources that formed part of general libraries. Hebrew books formed part and Jewish books formed part of theological libraries, library departments. They were integrated into hostile environments and not preserved in the context they had been created in. Or they were kept in private collections that often lacked professional arrangement and description. Thus, the creation of autonomous systems of knowledge and classifications for Jewish collections reflects the state of research in this discipline. It's a rich source for research into the categories, hierarchies of knowledge in Berlin at that time. As Ismar Elbogen stressed in 1918, there were basic Elemente, welche das Wissen zur Wissenschaft erheben. Systematik und Kritik. Nicht die Anhäufung von Kenntnissen macht die Wissenschaft, sondern ihre Einordnung, Verknüpfung und Wertung, ihre Erhebung zu allgemeinen, im ganzen Denkzusammenhang gültigen Begriffen. What could be more telling in this regard than the arrangement of a library, the context of knowledge created, the borders established, the value judgments imposed on its objects. Maybe these classifications even reflect taboos or neglected fields of research, for example, in parts of a classification which lacks detail. Finally, classification can also be a telling source with regard to the degree of professionalization of an institution. The library of the Hochschule had several librarians after each. And one might even find traces of their individual impact on the collection during the short time of its existence. Next picture, please. And I just wanted to show this picture and this nice quote because I liked it, because also students kind of were involved in the library work in the beginning of the institution. Arnold Esch's essay stresses that historiographical work involves both a rigid Quellenkritik, a critical approach to sources at hand, and an ability to think playfully. Esch's playfulness is a form of source criticism on its own terms, allowing uncertainties to become productive. It is necessary to imagine losses, for example, the books that might have belonged to the Hochschule, and which cannot really be numbered, or because since there is no catalog yet located. So it's important to imagine losses and to kind of do experiments in your head, instead of trying to be guided entirely by one's sources, in this case, the remnants, the books of the library of the Hochschule. I think to rely on fragments of a collection runs the risk of presenting something as a case study, as paradigmatic, which has simply been left over or remained by chance. In Esch's eyes, this would be reminiscent of children, I quote, who draw the target around their random hit. Instead, collection research can be about asking, in an informed way, of course, what must have been there, and to pay attention to potential distortions of reality through processes of transmission and handing down things. This involves imagination as well as knowledge about institutional, professional, economic, and cultural contexts. Thus, the reconstruction of a library sometimes requires practices that hardly appear on the surface of the academic text, and yet, in many cases, these parts of research are essential. As one examines actual copies of books, as well as contextual sources, not only one's knowledge of a collection is constantly being corrected, expanded, supplemented, but also one's knowledge of the institution that created this collection. In the end, the research Anna and Bettina are now engaging in makes it possible to understand the modus operandi of an institution, its research practices, some of which might also never have appeared on the surface of academic texts and therefore are all the more interesting objects of inquiry. Thank you.